So, the definition of a unit rate is a rate where the second number in your rate is 1 unit. So, for example, if you were going to drive 200 miles in 4 hours, you could represent this situation with the rate 200 miles for every 4 hours. And this rate is reducible, or you could simplify it because 200 and 4 are both divisible by 4. And so you could divide the top by 4, which tells you that you get 50 miles. If you divide the bottom by 4, that gives you 1 hour. And this tells you that driving at a speed of 50 miles for 1 hour is equivalent to the speed that you would drive if you drove 200 miles in 4 hours. And this reduced rate or simplified rate is actually a unit rate because the second number in the rate is 1 unit, or in this case, 1 hour. And the benefit of finding unit rates is that they're very easily scalable. Because if you know how many miles you go in 1 hour, then you can just multiply that number by however many hours you have. So if you want to figure out how many miles you would drive in 5 hours, you just do 50 times 5. If you want to figure out how many miles you would drive in, I don't know, like 7.5 hours, you would multiply 50 by 7.5. And so that's one of the benefits of finding the unit rate. Now, sometimes your reduced rate will not be a unit rate. Like in this case, if you can grade 7 papers every 2 minutes, well, 7 and 2 don't have any common factors, so you can't simplify it by dividing by any whole numbers. But you can still convert it into a unit rate by dividing by the denominator, because if you do 2 divided by 2, that will give you your 1 unit in the denominator. And if you divide the top by 2, that gives you 3.5. And so the unit rate tells you that you can grade 3.5 papers every minute. Now, one of the kind of interesting things about calculating the unit rate is this number will always be equivalent to this fraction, because 7 halves is the same thing as 3.5 or 3.5. And the reason why this always works out is because if I do 2 divided by 2 to get the 1 minute, well, if I do 7 divided by 2, that equals the fraction 7 halves, because fractions can be thought of as division. And so that relationship will always be present. So sometimes, or especially after your students are used to this, they may not even have to go through this process. They may just start looking at this fraction and they might use that as the unit rate, which is totally fine. Because what that is communicating is that you can grade 7 halves of a paper per minute, or 3.5 papers per minute. And when you're calculating the unit rates, there's always 2 unit rates for every proportional relationship. And those 2 unit rates are dependent on which unit you put in the numerator and which one you put in the denominator. So if you do 7 papers in 2 minutes, and you choose to put the 7 papers on the top, or the first part of the unit rate, then that tells you that you can grade 7 halves of a paper per minute, or 3.5 papers per minute. If you decide to put minutes on the top and papers on the bottom, then you get a different unit rate that tells you that it takes you 2/7 of a minute per paper. Now, both of these unit rates are communicating the same information. They're just scaled to a different part of the rate. First one is telling us how many papers you can do every minute. The second one is telling you how many minutes it takes to do every paper. So both of them are useful, and both of them represent the same information. And one way that you can help your students visualize the process of finding unit rates is with tape diagrams. So, the idea of a tape diagram is you use a strip of paper or whatever you want to represent the ratio that you're describing. So, if I can grade 7 papers in 2 minutes, I'm going to have this whole strip of paper correspond to the fact that I can grade 7 papers, and the amount of time that it takes is 2 minutes. So if I want to figure out how many papers I can grade in 1 minute, I just need to split the 7 papers in half. And when I split 7 in half, I get 3.5 papers in each of these little boxes here. And so that gives me the unit rate that I can do 3.5 papers per minute. And so that would be a way of visualizing the unit rate for 7 papers in 2 minutes, which is 7 halves or 3.5 papers per minute. This would be a visual way of helping your students see that. And you can also do this if you want to find the other unit rate. So with the other unit rate, I would say, okay, the total amount of time that it takes is 2 minutes, and the number of papers I can grade in that time is 7 papers. And so if I split up 2 minutes into 7 pieces, then I can figure out how many minutes it takes me to grade each paper, because each one of these little boxes represent my 7 papers, and the total amount of time is 2 minutes. And this will be easier for your students to figure out if you've done some equal sharing problems. Because if you've done a lot of equal sharing problems, they would realize if you take 2 minutes and split it up into 7 groups, each of the groups will have 2/7 of a minute. Um, and so that communicates the unit rate that it takes 2/7 of a minute to grade each paper. So to summarize, the main idea of unit rates is that the second number in your rate is the number 1, or in other words, it's 1 unit. So in this case, we were figuring out how many papers you can grade in 1 minute. In this case, we were looking at how many minutes it takes you to grade 1 paper. But that's the basic idea of a unit rate. And in later videos, we'll talk about how the unit rate relates to um, tables that you can make, as well as graphs, and how you can use the unit rate to solve proportional word problems. So I hope that this video makes sense. If you have any questions, let me know, and I hope you have a great day.